Uh, okay, so
No, no, I'll, yeah.
okay.
Hi everyone, welcome to the day 4 of Mini Astro Workshop Series 2020. I mean, thank you all for attending this past 3 days workshops. And as I keep saying, all the talks are recorded and are being uploaded to the YouTube slowly one by one. The first two talks are already uploaded, which were on Python and Julia programming and introduction to basics of command and interface and Git. And please go through them, and we have put our email addresses even on the GitHub page and even in the slides at as many places as possible. So please email us. We're always there to help you. And as you all may have heard already from Aman, he actually took the talk on introduction to programming in Python and Julia. Today, he's going to talk about fundamentals of stellar evolution and a little bit about stars and a little bit of about Aman. So he just recently joined Perimeter and University of Guelph in Canada to start where he started his PhD in computational astrophysics, wherein he would be working mainly on multi-messenger astrophysics and numerical relativity applied to compact binaries, core collapse supernovae, etc. And he has just graduated from BITS Pilani KK Birla Goa campus with a bachelor's in computer science and master's in physics. And in the past, he has worked on various topics ranging from quantum walks related to quantum information. He has also worked in Bose-Einstein condensates uh, and a little bit on quantum field theory too in regards to the condensates. And yeah, he also worked in a few cosmology projects too back in when he was in undergrad. So he do have a lot of experience on various topics, and you can always ask him over the email or during the Q&A that we're going to have after this talk, any questions that you may have regarding the career, making a career in astrophysics or any other such questions, apart from the questions that are related to the topic. I think with that, Aman, you can kick it off.
Thank you, Surendra, for that kind introduction. I couldn't have said it better. And hello, everyone. So Aman here, and if you have attended the second talk of this workshop, you must know me by now. Those who don't know, full name Aman Agarwal, and just started my PhD. Now, before starting this talk, which is titled "Stars and Their Evolution," I want to get some disclaimers and some general instructions through. The first is that I've tried to credit each information to its source. In my slides, I've taken information mainly from the IGNOU self-learned material and some other sources which I have credited in the slides, as well as the GitHub page. You can always go to these portals to get more information, more in-depth knowledge about the topics. The second is this will be more of an excuse me, information packed talk rather than the theory and derivations. So I'll try to present as much, cover as much breadth as I can about the topic. And uh, related to that, since this is more of an information packed talk, if I just go on in this one to all format where I just keep speaking and giving you information, it kind of becomes boring, dumping all the information once and for all. So what I have planned is there is part one of the talk where I'll discuss some fundamentals of stars, their HR diagram, and then we'll have a break of around 4 minutes or 5 minutes, and you can have some you can ask me questions, take a water break or anything, and then we'll return to the main topic, which is going into the depth of stellar evolution. And at the end, since this topic is so huge and diverse, rather than putting all the information in the slides, I've also constructed a quiz. So this is like, there's no grading, in this workshop, but this is a fun trivia contest I have tried to construct, and I'll give you the link to join. To you just have to type that link on your web browser, and then I'll give you a code, and you can join the quiz live.
Aman,
Okay?
maybe
Yes.
talk a bit louder.
Okay.
And as for questions, guys, you can always put them in the chat. And if there's some pressing question, I'll always try to bring it up with Aman. And
Yes.
if there
Yes.
is none, as Aman pointed out, there's a small break and you can ask in that window too.
Sure.
And if you want to ask a question, you can just say yes, click on yes, and I'll unmute you.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, so questions policy, as Surendra said, you can follow the questions policy in that manner. Fine. So let's come to the meat of the talk. In the first slide, I've put this little girl's picture where she's looking into this telescope and wondering, what is this five pointy shaped thing? What is it like? Why is it twinkling? Is it a diamond, or where is it? So this just reminds us of the nursery rhyme we have all read, Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. And the reason I bring this rhyme to you, jog your memories about this rhyme, is because the questions posed by that childhood wonderment is very similar to the questions we try to research now, which I have collected a few of them, few of the fundamentals questions as part of a quest. So let's see what our quest is all about. Our quest has these fundamental questions which are very active research fields in contemporary world. So let's see the questions. The first question is, what are stars made of? How do we observe them? Where are they twinkling? How are they formed? How do they die? And how many types of stars are there? Very relevant questions asked with childhood wonderment, but still relevant even now. And I'll try to give some short answers to some of the questions and go in depth about the other questions due to the time limit, or else I would have covered all these questions. Okay, let's see some short answer reviews of these questions. First question, what are stars made of? That is related to the star structure and composition. Okay, and that is researched using stellar spectra. And we'll discuss stellar spectroscopy in the coming slides. So we'll get more details about that. The second question, fundamental question, is how do we observe them? So that happens because stars emit light. They do not emit light only in the visible radiation. They also emit light in most of in all of the EM wavelength EM radiation wavelength available. And also there is not only electromagnetic radiation, there are non-electromagnetic radiations also, like gravitational waves are there, neutrinos are there. So that is how we observe the star, because they radiate. And the science dealing with this observation and all is observational astronomy. We have all these telescopes. We have Fermi telescope, Hubble telescope, James Webb telescope, which is up and coming. So all these telescopes deal with this area of our quest. Now the third question is, where are they twinkling? So there is a celestial coordinate system set up by astronomers, which define the position of the star in a constructed sphere called celestial sphere. If you want to go into the depth of that, you can again ask questions, or just research a little bit about celestial coordinates, and you'll get to know about this. The answer I am very interested in the sky surveys. These are surveys about the sky done in different wavelengths, either gamma rays or visible range, and there are different sky surveys around the globe. Sloan Digital Sky Survey, Cosmic Lens Survey. So all these surveys are out there. They are surveying the night sky and looking for objects, focusing on different objects, looking for extraterrestrial life also. So yeah, this is the research field related to this fundamental question. The other fundamental question we have is, how are they formed? And that is related to the research area of gravitational collapse and star formation, very dynamic research area. And you'll also have two talks in this workshop by Raghav and Shivan. So stay tuned for those talks. Then there's one question is, how do they die? Or do they die at all? Do we know anything? What happens to the star? Do they follow our life cycle? So that again comes from supernova, compact stars, and the most intriguing object any uh, person has regarding astronomy, astrophysics, black holes, and neutron stars also come in this area. So we'll discuss this question in a little bit of depth in this talk because we'll be dealing with stellar evolution. And at last, one question which we'll again deal with this in this talk is how many types of stars are there, and this is also related to stellar evolution because in different stages of life of the star, depending on their masses, different types of stars are defined, and also the stars are defined based on their spectra and structure. So we'll get to those classification also. So first, let's go through this question. How do we observe the stars? Okay, and as I had said, stars emit radiation, not only in visible range, but in all kinds of wavelengths. And even in visible range, we don't have stars emitting just one color of radiation. We have stars emitting all the colors. We have blue stars, red stars, yellow stars. Blue star is a Rigel is a blue star. Red star, Betelgeuse and Aldebaran are red giants. Then yellow star, our sun is a yellow star. So the stars emit radiation in different wavelengths. Okay, and there's a science of spectroscopy which refers to the analysis of this light in terms of its wavelength and is extensively used to obtain information regarding the temperature, the composition, the luminosity, different parameters of the star. Okay, now if you see this diagram, you can see a very beautiful Vibgyor color. Okay, and then you can see some black bands, and that black bands is the absorption spectra. These bands are the fingerprint of elements. Okay, I'll come to how are the fingerprint of the elements, but they are unique to different elements. Like this band corresponds to sodium over here, and this band to H alpha. So different bands give the signature of different elements. Okay, and this funky looking notation, there's A, B, G, F, all out of place in out of alphabetical order. I'll define this also. uh, but this is a general picture of a stellar spectra where you have a background and then there are these absorption bands or there the emission bands also. So let's jog up our 11, 12 knowledge. What is emission and absorption? Emission spectra is very simple. Electrons are in energy level around the nuclei. So when an electron from a higher energy level transits to a lower energy level, it releases a certain amount of energy in the form of a photon, or a quanta of energy is released in the form of a photon. And that photon, when we observe it, or when our spectroscope observes it, it's a bright line, and that bright line is called the emission line, bright emission line. Similarly, we also have an absorption spectra when the opposite transition occurs from the lower energy level, the electron absorbs an incoming photon radiation, a photon quanta, it goes to the higher level. And so that energy photon which has been absorbed from a background of sea of photons, that background, when those sea of photons will hit our spectroscope, that energy photon which was absorbed would be missing. So we'll have a dark absorption line. Okay. Generally, this is how absorption spectra is observed. We have a light from a continuous spectrum, and when it passes through a relatively cooler astrophysical gas, we get absorption spectrum. And since these energy levels are uniquely defined for different quantum levels and different atoms, we have the amount of energy absorbed or radiated by different atoms, or the different isotopes, are very unique. And that is why these absorptions and emission lines are called the unique signature of the elements. So if we have a spectra with us, and if we see these different lines, we know which element it is. And so we can get to know the answer to the question, what are stars made up of? What is their composition? Through this spectra, we get to know the chemical composition of the stars. Okay. Then we come to our second question of our quest. How many types of stars are there? And we'll go through this question using the stellar spectra, and also through the stellar evolution. First, let's go through the stellar spectra classification, which is called spectroluminosity classification. I'll break that down in the coming slides. The first, the first ever classification of stars was done by Annie J. Cannon. You can see her over here. And she classified more than 250,000 stars by observing the strength of the absorption lines in their spectra. Okay. And she gave them, divided them into 7 classes: O, B, A, F, G, K, M. There's a very cute mnemonic to remember this: O, be a fine guy / girl, kiss me. So this mnemonic you can remember for the spectral classes. And later, an Indian scientist, Dr. M.N. Shah, he showed that this spectral classification done by Dr. Annie, she classified based on the intensity or the strength of the absorption lines. And he basically proved that the strength of the absorption lines depend on the surface temperature of the star. Okay, so what Dr. Annie classified as spectral classes was basically temperature classes. Each spectral class corresponds to a certain temperature. Okay, and this table very nicely summarizes each spectral class and the approximate surface temperature and different other parameters. What are the Balmer lines, intensity, what are the other spectral features, how does that, what is a naked eye example of the star, and how do they look to us visibly. Okay. Later, for greater precision, astronomers divided each spectral class into 10 subspectral class, which like, let's say class A was divided into A0, A1, A2, all the way till A9. And this was done because, remember, each spectral class corresponds to a certain temperature. So our sun is a G2 star. So G2 spectral class corresponds to a temperature of 5800 Kelvin, plus and minus 5% deviation. To bring the deviation to 5%, this subspectral division was done. Okay. Now, another very important approximation for stars which is done is the black body approximation. The stars, we know about black bodies from our 11, 12 physics. So black bodies emit radiation at finite temperatures, peaking at a certain wavelength. Let's say this is a black body at 3000 Kelvin. So the radiation emitted by this black body, it emits a continuous spectrum. It emits radiation in all the possible wavelengths, and at a certain wavelength, the emission rate is the highest. Okay, so this peak wavelength, this highest wavelength emission is called the peak wavelength of the black body. And stars can also be approximated as a black body, and their effective black body temperature can be calculated using this very simple relationship. We just need to find out at which lambda the highest emission is occurring, and if I plug in that lambda over here, I'll get the effective black body temperature of the star. Now, why am I discussing this effective temperature? This effective temperature is basically an axis of the HR diagram, which is one of the most useful diagrams in astrophysics. We'll get to that in just a bit. Before that, I just need one more construct. I have defined effective temperature to you. Other construct is the luminosity of the star. The luminosity of a star is defined as the total energy radiated by it in 1 second, consisting of radiations in all wavelengths, not just in visible, but in IR, UV, gamma, all the wavelengths. Okay. And when we observe the star, astronomers have this this metric of apparent magnitude to measure the brightness of the star. And how do they measure? They just see that star in their mind. They think, okay, I saw the sun in the morning, how bright was it? And then I compare the brightness of this star to the sun or the moon, and that is how they find out the apparent magnitude of the star, by defining it as a ratio. Okay, this is 1/5 of the sun's, this is approximately 1/5 of the sun's brightness, so I'll define its apparent magnitude as 1/5. So similarly, they have given a magnitude value to sun, moon, and all these standard astrophysical elements. And then any astrophysical element, they'll just compare to this standard elements, and then they'll define the apparent magnitude of that astrophysical element. But this is a very apparent scale. We need some absolute scale. So for that, what we also have an absolute metric where we assume all the astrophysical objects are on a 10 parsec sphere, the 10 parsec radius sphere around the Earth. So all the astrophysical objects are 10 parsec away from us. That is what we assume. If something is not 10 parsec away from us, we bring it to the 10 parsec level by doing an apparent shift, and there's a formula for that. So when all these objects are at a 10 parsec distance, now we can have a standard measuring scale, and that is called the absolute magnitude. But that still is only the visible magnitude. As I have said, I am trying to build something, a measure for luminosity, and luminosity, as I've said, is radiations in all wavelengths. So from visible, I need to make some correction to include the effect of all wavelengths, and that is called the bolometric correction. So in this way, by following some formulas and all constructs, we get the absolute bolometric magnitude of the star, which is a measure of its brightness in all different wavelengths. Okay, we know the absolute bolometric magnitude of the sun. We also know the luminosity of the sun. So by this simple formula, we can calculate the luminosity of the star. Voila, we have a luminosity measure of the star. But this is a very phenomenological way. Okay, I'm observing something, then I'm comparing it to something, and so on and so forth. Can I have a theoretical construct? Yes, I can. I can again assume that the star is a black body. In a black body approximation, I can assume that the star is a black body, and so the black body's radiation energy is given by Stefan's law. It is proportional to the fourth power of the effective temperature, and so the luminosity is just the area into the energy emitted. So 4 pi r square sigma t power 4. And again, I know the luminosity of the sun, the radius of the sun, and the effective temperature of the sun. So I can have this very nice comparison where if I know the radius of some star and the temperature of some star, I can know its luminosity, or if I know the luminosity, I can know its temperature. This is also a very nice formula to show us that the luminosity and the effective temperature have some relationship. And based on this very important relationship, we have an indispensable diagram in astrophysics, which is the HR diagram, the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. Okay, it classifies stars on the basis of their luminosity and the effective temperature. You can see the luminosity is on the y-axis and the effective temperature is on the x-axis. Be mindful that the effective temperature has an opposite trend where it's decreasing from left to right, not increasing. Now, when you place stars on this HR diagram, like I know the luminosity of Spica and I know its effective temperature, so I know the star will lie over here. So when I place all the stars I know, or all the stars in a cluster in the HR diagram, they distinctively follow a pattern where most of the stars will lie on this diagonal. And this diagonal, central diagonal, is called the main sequence. Main sequence stars account for nearly 90% of all the stars. Okay, and they are called, when a star, we'll see in stellar evolution, most of the stars in stellar evolution are very young. In main sequence are very young in their stellar evolution stage, and when a star enters the main sequence, it's also said that the star has just been born. So you can just think of it as the main sequence as the entry point of the star in the HR diagram. Okay, we'll discuss that later after a break also. But there are other classes of stars also on the HR diagram, and those are the giants, supergiants, and the white dwarfs. This area consists of the giants, this area. And these are stars which are very huge. And remember, if you see this relationship, L is proportional to R square. So huge stars will obviously have huge luminosities. So the giants are always above the main sequence stars because their radius is much more. And being above means that luminosity is high because the y-axis represents luminosity. Okay, and we also have supergiants which have the highest luminosity, and they can have very low temperature, they can have very high temperature also. Not very high, because they are radiating a lot of energy very quickly, so their temperature is in the intermediate or in the low range generally. The diameters of supergiants are roughly 100 to 1000 times the diameter of the sun. They're huge. And this is the giant phase in the stellar evolution we'll discuss later. Next, there's another class of stars in this HR diagram, which are the white dwarfs. As you can see, their luminosity is very low. So from this, we can infer their radius might be very low. Because if I keep the temperature constant, remember L proportional to R square T4. So now if I just look at the 10,000 vertical line, so the temperature is constant. So L is proportional to R square. So for the same effective temperature, white dwarfs have much less luminosity than say Sirius. So the white dwarfs should have much less radius than Sirius, and that is the distinct feature of white stars. One more feature is that they lie to the bottom left corner of the HR diagram, which means that the white dwarfs have very high temperature. So these are stars with very low luminosity and very high temperature. What can you infer from that? That means that they have a lot of energy, but they are radiating it very slowly. So white dwarfs can remain as a degenerate gas for a very long amount of time. Okay, so at last we come to the final peg of this classification, spectroluminosity classification. Till now I have only discussed spectral classification, where we have G2, G3, A0, A9. That is the spectral classification. We add another dimension to it, luminosity classification, based on the HR diagram and on another parameter, which is the broadening of the spectral lengths. Now, the spectrum of an isolated atom is always very sharp. Okay, but if the atoms are in a collection, if we have a gas of atoms, so due to collision, those sharp peaks or dips in the spectrum, which is the absorption and emission, those will get broadened. And depending on the density of the star, this broadening will be higher. If the density is high, the broadening will be higher. So the most dense stars will have the most broadened absorption and emission features. And based on this broadening, we divide the stars into 5 luminosity classes, where the main sequence is the 5th luminosity class. Main sequence is the densest among these stars. Remember, neutron stars and black holes are not being considered over here. Okay, so main sequence is the densest, and it is being given the 5th luminosity class. Its broadening is much more than any other luminosity class. And then as we go above, subgiants are 4th class, giants are 3rd class, bright giants are 2, subgiants 1b. As we go from 5 to 1, the broadening decreases. Why? Because as the star becomes a giant, it has very low density because it's huge. The material is remaining same, but the radius has increased, so the density is decreasing. And since the density is decreasing, the broadening of the spectral features is also decreasing. So that is why bright giants and supergiants have a separate luminosity class rather than other than main sequence. So if I go to the final spectroluminosity classification, our sun, for example, is a G2 5-star. It's a main sequence star and it lies in the G2 spectral type. So that complete classification is called the spectroluminosity classification. Okay, so this is a nice time to take a break. I know this has escalated a lot from a nursery rhyme to this HR diagram, complex HR diagram. So we'll take a break of 4-5 minutes, and I can discuss questions this while. And yeah, the 5 minutes break. You can have water and you can ask questions.
So there are 2 questions currently on the chat.
Okay.
So I'll read them for you. One from Divyanshu Tiwari. He's
Okay.
asking, are there green stars too? Is there a stage where the star emits light of green spectrum in the peak emission?
Okay, yes. So all possible this radiation can happen. You can see around 4000 Kelvin, there must be a greenish tinge to the star. If the effective temperature is around 4000 Kelvin. So yes, there must be green stars, but I can't remember a naked eye example of that. Sorry.
Okay. And
Yeah.
next, Venu.
Also, one more thing I want to add is colors will also get scattered. So that might also be a reason we might not see green color that much. Yeah.
And next, Venu Dingra is asking the brightness of star observed by us also depends on the distance of the source. So how can it be measure of total energy and in turn be used to calculate luminosity?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the brightness observed by us depends on distance, really nicely pointed out, but that is again the apparent magnitude construct. When I had discussed this, that is the apparent magnitude of the star. What we take all the stars and all the astrophysical objects out there, and we bring them all to a 10 parsec distance. How do we bring them? There's a very good formula for that. There's a log r by 10 formula. If you just input the distance of the star in that formula, that will make a construct such that the star is at 10 parsec distance from us. And since all the objects are 10 parsec distance from us, now the distance dependence of that new construct, that new construct is not dependent on the distance, and that is called the absolute magnitude. So the absolute magnitude of objects are not dependent on the distance of those objects from Earth.
And next, Vandana is asking where do neutron stars fall on the HR diagram?
Okay, that's a really good question. So neutron stars will have uh, very low luminosity because they are quite small, and they'll have a higher temperature also. So my estimate would be somewhere in the bottom left only. I'm not very sure, but yeah, luminosity will be very low. So they'll be in the bottom side of the HR diagram, but I'm a bit unsure on their temperature range. So just pardon me for that. I will answer that. Just give me some time. I'll answer them. Answer that. Maybe you can email me, or I'll answer that in the chat later. Suri, you can
Yeah,
also add if you know like
yeah, I
temperature
was
range.
going to
Yeah,
add.
yeah, yeah.
So it does fall where you actually said it does fall on the bottom left,
Okay.
but then you have to imagine that the luminosity is so low that if you actually try to put the neutron stars on the HR diagram, uh, the HR diagram should be so big that it cannot actually account for the neutron stars. So they're
Yes,
so
yes,
bottom right, bottom left.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Okay, so temperature wise also very hot. Yeah, yes. So yeah, but I would have guessed that only because since they have the size of a city, so and these white dwarfs are also comparatively much bigger than that. So yeah, would have to go very low bottom left in the HR diagram.
And next, Kashyap Gori is asking exactly what is a star. I know, but how to define that?
Okay, how do you define a star? Okay, I never learned bookish definitions, but when somebody asks me what is a star, how do you define a star, I'll ask some fundamental questions which I have given in my quest. That I'll try to answer some fundamental questions. So, what is a star? I'll try to answer what is the star made up of. So, the star is made up of hydrogen, helium, and other elements. And then how are they held together, like what is the main force, gravitational force is holding them together, and where are they can be present in clusters, galaxies, and all this. So that definition can have different angles. If you would ask a much more targeted question, that would be better. But yeah, I would give the definition of a star as a collection of gas, or a collection of atoms and different nuclei and elements held together by
And next,
gravitational force.
the next question from Nitesh Kumar is why white dwarf radiate at very low rate even though they have high temperatures?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So luminosity, like I showed over here, luminosity is dependent uh, to the square of radius. Okay, And if I keep the temperature square of radius and the fourth power of temperature, okay. Now temperature is on the x-axis. We have white dwarfs, both white dwarfs, main sequence, giants, and super giants at a temperature of 10,000 Kelvin. But what is differing is the radius of the white dwarf. White dwarf is a white dwarf at 10,000 Kelvin is much less smaller than a main sequence or a giant star. And since the temperature is constant over here, I can effectively remove this part. So the luminosity will directly depend on the square of the radius. So since the radius of the star is so low, it radiates a lot less. And that's why its luminosity is very low, even though its temperature is high.
And the last question for this short minute break is Venu Dingra is asking, can it be said that the stars on main sequence have approximately similar radii?
No, it can't be said that, because approximately similar radii, no, because you see luminosity is varying. The luminosity is scanning from 0.0001 to 100,000. Okay, and luminosity is very dependent on the temperature. Now, it's scanning the temperature also. But yeah, we have variations in radius. It's not almost constant, but yes, if you consider compare it to the let's say giants, super giants. Wait, sorry, I forgot. What was the question about it? Was it about mass or radius? I
No,
just
radius.
went
So they
it.
just want to know. I think he's asking two questions. The first one is, can it be said that the stars on main sequence have approximately similar radii?
No,
Yeah.
it
And the
can't be said that.
second question is, why is that the generally large radius stars radiate too much and have low temperature?
Okay, so why do they have low temperature? Because generally huge radius stars are formed from the low radius stars. So the low radius stars, when it expands to the giant phase, see, its volume has expanded, okay, but the energy has remained same. So the temperature, you will naturally expect the temperature to drop down, right? A very classical system if I take. So that is why generally they have low temperature. Why do they radiate so much? Because their radius is so huge. Luminosity depends on the square of the radius. So since the radius is so huge, the luminosity is so huge.
Okay, I think we can take one last question by
Okay.
Atharva Bahekar. He's asking, in this HR diagram, can a bigger radius mean more mass?
Can a bigger radius mean more
More
mass?
mass.
Okay. Wow, that's a good question. So luminosity is directly related to the mass of a star. In classes, I'll get to that. And luminosity is also related to the radius of the star. So in an indirect way, mass and radius are related. So yes, if generally in the main sequence, I can say for sure, if the mass is more, the radius is more, and vice versa. For the other classes, also giants, super giants, we also have some relationships. And generally, if the radius is more, mass is more. Yes, but obviously there are exceptions.
Yeah, just to add a little thing to that, you have to remember, guys, only the stars which are in main sequence are actually producing light by using nuclear fusion or any nucleosynthesis. But any other stars that you see here, like the compact stars like white dwarfs or neutron stars, they don't have any nuclear fusion happening. So for them, the relations between the luminosity, radius, temperature will be slightly different.
Yes. Oh, great. Thanks for the addition. So should I continue?
Yeah, man.
Okay, cool. So next, let's get to the main part of the talk, the stellar evolution. For that, we'll closely follow the HR diagram. There's a lot of host of information from the HR diagram. We can get the age of the star, size of the star, luminosity, spectral type, absolute magnitude, and surface temperature. These four are the axis of the uh, HR diagram. So if I know the position of a star in the HR diagram, I obviously know these four. Luminosity is related to the mass of the star, at least in the main sequence. Luminosity is related to the mass to the power of 3.5 of the star. So yes, we get the information of the mass of the star from the HR diagram also, since 90% of the stars lie on the HR on the main sequence. So we almost 90% of the time I'll get a good estimate of the mass. Then age. If the star is lying on the main sequence, I know the star is quite young. If the star is in the giant white dwarf phase, I know it is nearing its death. uh, Size, obviously if the luminosity is more, the upper part of the HR diagram consists of higher radius stars, so the size estimate also we get from the HR diagram. So there's a host of information I can draw from the HR diagram. So since the HR diagram is so powerful, I must also get stellar evolution information from the HR diagram, and that is exactly what I'll do. I'll try to show the life cycle, the birth, the death, the journey, the life journey of a star on the HR diagram. Okay, so for that, first we'll see a video and then we'll discuss what are the different aspects. In this video, let me start sharing that video. Hi, I hope you can see a black screen, a YouTube black screen. So now what I'll do, this is a simulation by some people at the Ohio State University. And what they have done is they have simulated a star cluster, a collection of stars. They took some initial configuration of those stars on the HR diagram, and that initial configuration, they just dumped it on the HR diagram. And then they used some stellar evolution models, stellar evolution codes, and evolved each star from its birth to its death on the HR diagram. So there was a evolution of the whole cluster. Each star in the cluster was evolved. So that we can see the cluster also evolving as time progresses. So the evolution was from 100K years to the 19G years. And some details about the initial configuration. The cluster has around 30,000 solar metallicity stars. Solar metallicity means around the same metallicity that our sun has. And they gave some initial mass function that the masses will vary from 0.3 to 30 solar masses. And they, on the HR diagram where they have shown the evolution, they have plotted a green line showing the zero age main sequence. They have taken the stellar evolution models from the MIST database. Now let's see the evolution. If you see this, this is the initial configuration they have taken. How did they take the initial configuration? They had some initial configuration codes. From that, they generated around 30,000 stars with different masses, different temperatures, different luminosities. And that initial configuration, they just plotted on the HR diagram. So this is my star cluster around 100K years old. Now we'll see how different stars in the star cluster evolve as time progresses. You can see the time progressing over here. See, most of the stars will start falling to the main sequence line. Okay, some of the stars will start running off to the giant sector, giant and supergiant sector, and some of the stars will then round off and come back to the white dwarf sector. And as it goes till 19G years, this is the final configuration of the star cluster around 19G years old. And there are some distinctive features. First is that the star first scanned the whole main sequence, but later on the stars in the star cluster scanned the whole main sequence. But as the star cluster grew older, most of the stars ended up in the lower half of the main sequence, and that is because the luminosity is decreasing. Remember, they are burning up fuel, right? So since they are burning up fuel, the radiation pressure is decreasing slightly, and that is why they are contracting. And since they are contracting, most of the stars, their radius is decreasing, and the luminosity is decreasing, and also their temperature over time is decreasing. So this is not a very huge decrease if we talk about other stellar evolutions and other stellar decreases and increases, but this is a general trend, not a very catastrophic event, but a general trend that the stars will tend to go towards the lower half of the main sequence. While going to the lower half, some of the stars, they just ran off to the giant phase, and that happens. The star expands in size. Why does it expand? We'll get to that later. But they expand in size and they go to the giant phase. Now, if you would have seen that as time progresses, the number of stars in the giant phase didn't remain constant. And why was that? That was because the giant phase is not a stable phase. These stars from giant phase generally go to other phases, like they'll become compact stars, or they'll just go throw off in a planetary nebula and become a white dwarf. So stars do not remain constant over here also. Like in from main sequence they were running off, stars do run off from here. And even these white dwarfs, though white dwarfs are generally very stable, we also have many white dwarfs in binary condition, or we have white dwarfs with some cloud of gas around them. So white dwarfs also accrete mass over time. And since they accrete mass, their mass crosses a certain limit, which is called the Chandrasekhar limit. We'll also discuss that later. But after that limit, those white dwarfs also they do not remain white dwarfs anymore, and they have further evolution. So that is why the number of stars in the giant phase or in the white dwarf or in the main sequence wasn't remaining constant, if you would have observed. Okay, so this was a very nice evolution on the HR diagram. Let's give the credit to Professor Richard Pogg, the Ohio State University prof. And yeah, so this graphics were composed in Python using Matplotlib. So you can see Python is such a strong tool. Okay, let me stop this share, pause this share, and go back to my slide.
Yeah, guys, even FFmpeg that you see on the screen here, that's a famous software to combine images, etc.
Yes, thank you, Surendra. Okay, so now you should be again seeing my slides. Now, okay, we saw that very nice video. Now let's make sense of it. Okay, before making sense of that video and going into more details about stellar evolution, there is a very important concept which goes hand in hand with stellar evolution, and which is nucleosynthesis. Okay, and the abundance of nuclear and chemical matter in the universe and in different places. That is a topic which goes very hand in hand with stellar evolution. So right now it must look that where is nuclear physics, where am I marrying nuclear physics with stellar physics, but it will make sense after a while. First, let me give some definitions. Like someone asked the definition of a star. So voila, you have a definition of a stable star for now. A stable star is formed when an equilibrium between a gravitational force of a collapsing cloud and the radiation pressure due to the nuclear energy generated in its core is attained. What do I mean by that? In the starting, we just have a cloud of gas, and then that cloud of gas, through its own self-gravity, starts collapsing. And when we have the spherical matter collapsing, that is what we call a protostar. But a protostar is not stable. Protostar keeps on decreasing, and it keeps on decreasing till that time, till it's the core of the star, the innermost part of the star, starts burning hydrogen. The nuclear fusion in the core starts. And when that nuclear fusion starts, there's radiation due to that nuclear reaction. Gamma radiation is released, and all the other different radiations are released. And that radiation, when it is going outwards, it will have some pressure. It will give an outward push to the collapsing cloud. And when these push and the gravitational pull and the radiation push is equilibrated, is equal to each other, then we have a stable star. And that is the definition of a stable star or a main sequence star. Now, the chemical abundances, if we try to plot the abundance of nuclear matter or chemical matter in these stable stars, or even in our sun, or even on earth, or even on meteorites, when we try to plot the abundances, what do I mean by abundance? How much of iron nuclei is there, how much of copper nuclei is there, different nuclei abundance. When I try to calculate they more or less follow the same pattern. Their relative abundance is almost the same. And this pattern is followed in a lot of cosmological scales. It is followed in the solar system, it is followed on the Earth, it is followed in the galaxy level. By spectroscopy of cosmic rays, meteorites, solar spectrum, we can calculate this abundance ratio. And this relative abundance remains same on many scales. This is a very intriguing question. And how does this marry with the stellar evolution concept? Because we consider most of the elements apart from hydrogen and helium are born out in stars. And how are they born, how are they created, is exactly the process of stellar evolution. So if we want to answer the question what is stellar evolution, we also have to keep an auxiliary question in mind, that how are the elements formed and why are the elements ratio so much similar across these cosmological scales. And we'll try to answer these two questions hand in hand. Okay, now let's get into the meat of the problem. The first, I said that from protostar we get a stable star, and that stable star enters the main sequence when it starts burning hydrogen. You can burn hydrogen mainly by two processes: the pp chain, the proton-proton chain, and the carbon-nitrogen cycle, CNO cycle. I have never learned the details of these cycle, and I have really huge ugly diagrams of both these cycles. These are just very plain simple formats I took, but if you go to the in-depth of these cycles, you'll see a lot of intermediaries and a lot of processes, much more than one's present over here. The basic thing that is happening is combining of protons or hydrogen atoms with protons into helium atoms. That is the main thing happening. If you do not have any higher elements, it will happen through the pp chain. If you have higher elements like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, they'll act as a catalyst, and you can combine the 4 hydrogen into helium and the catalyst remain unchanged. Okay, one feature of main sequence is, I have said that earlier, the luminosity and mass of a main sequence are proportional, and that is luminosity is proportional to the mass power 3.5. And since luminosity is related to the energy radiated per second, I can also calculate the time spent in the main sequence using luminosity. And the time spent in main sequence is also proportional to the mass of the object, mass power minus 2.5. Okay. One more definition I want to get through is of the generation of stars. The stars which do not have higher elements and just burn material through pp chain, proton-proton chain, are called first generation stars, and they are very old stars. They do not have, they just started with hydrogen and helium provided from the universe, and that is how they started burning their hydrogen. But stars which already have carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, how do they get that material? They get it either from the interstellar medium, the medium surrounding them, and or from other stars, accreting other stars. And how do those acquire these higher elements, the interstellar medium and the other stars? Through supernova. And I'll get to that. So when supernova of other stars happen, the higher elements are injected into the ISM or the neighboring stars, and that, when acquired by a star which is known as a second generation star, can then start burning hydrogen using the CNO cycle. Okay, now we have discussed the main sequence, and that is where the star enters after being born. But then star has to move somewhere. As we saw in the HR diagram, the star evolves on the HR diagram. The star doesn't remain fixed on the HR diagram on the main sequence. This evolution is proportional to the mass of the star. Okay, and depending on the mass, the trajectory followed on the HR diagram, or the later stages or the depth of the star, is different for different masses. So first I'll give some general trend, and then I'll go to specific mass ranges, that what happens for a solar mass star, what happens for a 10 solar mass stars, what happens for a 15 solar mass star. I'll go to different ranges later. So the first thing that happens is after the hydrogen is burnt up, the radiation pressure decreases. Remember, the radiation pressure is holding the star right now against gravitational collapse. So the core is contracting. And what that does is it stuffs more and more element into a smaller and smaller space. Naturally, collision increases, temperature increases. I can have much higher element synthesis because they require much more energy. So energy is there and I can synthesize heavier elements. So the stars which have generally low mass, solar mass or subsolar mass, they will have hydrogen burning up to helium, and then they won't have so much energy to generally to synthesize more heavier elements in the core. So what they'll do is the then their core will contract, okay, and what will happen? A thin shell around the core will then start burning hydrogen into helium. Remember, the star is a core, a mantle, a envelope. There are many. A star is onion shaped, basically. So there are many layers to the star. So when the core is contracting because it is not being held up by radiation pressure anymore, a very thin shell around the core will start burning hydrogen and become helium. Now that shell, its mass has increased, so it becomes heavier, it will fall on the core and become part of the core. Now the core has become more heavy, so it will contract more quickly. Since it is contracting more quickly, more energy will be given to the outer shell. That outer shell will convert to helium more quickly, and so on and so forth. We have some of a runoff process. So in this runoff process, when the core material is falling on the core and it is keeping on contracting and increasing its energy, what happens? This energy then is pushed out by the core, and that energy which is pushed out by the core, it takes the envelope of the star with itself, and thus it increases the size of the star, and the star expands in size and becomes a giant star. This is for low mass stars I'm discussing. And since it expands in size, its energy, which if I consider is conserved, since that energy has now got a huge area, the temperature of the star relatively decreases and the surface becomes cooler, but its luminosity increases enormously because the surface area has increased. This was for low mass stars. But if we have heavier stars, this cycle of contraction and heavier element, now the heavier stars will have high enough temperature to do heavy element synthesis in the core, and the contraction will also happen. A shell around the core will become helium and it will fall on the core, and then again the core will accelerate in its contraction. All this will happen. This will happen till the nuclei in the core becomes iron nuclei and we have an iron core, and elements heavier than iron won't be able to get synthesized because the average binding energy of per nucleon is highest around iron. So iron is like the most stable nuclei. So if you want to break up iron, you need to provide much more energy than you are extracting. Okay, so the core goes up till iron for the heavier stars. What happens to the star then? I'll discuss. But first, I'll finish off with the low mass stars and then I'll go to the heavier mass stars. Okay, so now I'm considering a specific range of mass, that is the solar mass stars. And solar mass stars have a particular trend where they'll remain in the main sequence and then they'll have helium core, and suddenly when the contraction is happening, the helium also burns, and this helium burning is rather abrupt for reasons we don't quite understand completely, but this burning is abrupt. And since something which happens abrupt, either it can happen adiabatically or it will just expel energy, right? So this also expels energy, and very in a very short amount of time a lot of energy is expelled, and that energy expulsion is called a helium flash. And this energy, when it is being expelled, it will take the outer envelope of the star with itself. So we'll have a helium flash, and then we'll have the core remaining in between and some material envelope surrounding it. And when you look through the telescope, it would seem like there's a gas And in middle of the gas, there's a small planet residing, and that is called a planetary nebula. Okay. Now, how is that core? Now, you'll ask me, the core is contracting. What is happening to the core? The core's contraction will stop after some time. And why it will stop is it will start breaking up as we stuff element together and together and together. Now the nuclei will start breaking up because I'm decreasing the space so and so. So I'm providing energy to the system. So now I can do fission reaction rather than fusion. So now the elements will break up into proton, electron, neutron, into nuclei and electrons basically. And these electrons are fermions. And we know we have a Pauli's exclusion principle that no two electrons can occupy the same quantum state. So, and the quantum state is basically a state of certain energy. So first, the electrons, when the star's core is just made up of electrons and nuclei, what will happen? The electrons will start filling up these quantum energy levels. This first they'll start filling up the lower energy levels, and so on and so forth. They'll slowly fill the higher energy levels. Now, when some energy levels are filled up, an incoming electron trying to fit in the shell because I'm contracting the star more and more. So electrons from outer layers are coming and trying to fit in the lower energy, high energy levels. So these electrons, they won't be able to occupy the lower energy states, and then they'll have some pressure. They'll have to occupy the higher energy state. And you can imagine what is higher energy state. Higher energy state means it has to be more energetic. So it gets some pressure. It can't release its energy and go to the lower energy state, and it faces some pressure, and that is called a degenerate gas pressure. And that is only due to the Pauli's exclusion principle that no two fermions can occupy the same quantum state. Okay, so this degenerate gas pressure is what holds the gravitational collapse. Like Surendra said, fusion is not happening in these stars. The degenerate gas is holding uh, the, the further gravitational collapse. And this is a very fairly stable system which can remain so and so for a long amount of time. But there's a limit to the amount of gravitational collapse electron degeneracy can handle. If the mass of the star is less than 1.4 solar mass, electron degeneracy pressure is good to go. It will hold the gravitational collapse. But if it is more than 1.4 solar mass, then gravitational collapse overcomes the electron degeneracy pressure, and we have further processes happening. Then we have nucleons forming. The electrons also go away in other nuclear reactions, and we have the star is generally made up of nucleons, neutrons, and protons. Okay, this limit, there's a theoretical derivation of the limit, and it was done by this great man, Dr. Chandrasekhar, Indian astrophysicist, and he gave this limit, which is now known as the Chandrasekhar limit. Okay. Now this was for the solar mass star. Solar mass star basically goes from main sequence to the giant stage. From giant stage, it has a helium flash, forms a planetary nebula, and ultimately forms a white dwarf. Now, let's come to some more massive stars, greater than 10 solar mass or so. What happens, as I had said earlier, in the general trend, in the massive stars, the nuclei, the core, sorry, is going on fusion, fusion, fusion. As the core contraction is happening, the fusion is happening. And fusion happens till iron nuclei. But after iron nuclei, what? The core is forced to contract because now there is no more fusion. So the gravitation, there's no radiation pressure to balance the gravitational collapse. So the core is forced to collapse. And what happens is this collapse now is stuffing elements in a denser and denser area. So now we'll again have fission. And disintegration of iron nuclei, as I said, you need to provide much more energy than what you get. So it is a, excuse me, it is an endothermic process. And where does this absorb, this endothermic process absorb energy from? It absorbs energy from the gravitational collapse. Now to feed this process, the gravitational collapse will start occurring more quickly, because it needs to feed a runoff process. The iron core fusion is happening, and fission, as time increases, fission is increasing. So it demands more and more energy. So more and more collapse will happen, which will result to more and more fission and more collapse, and so on and so forth. So this is a feedback mechanism, and runoff is happening. And this runoff, what it does, it essentially breaks down all the nuclei into helium nuclei, and then further the helium nuclei is also broken down into nucleons, protons and neutrons. Okay. Uh, this was for the core. The core is contracting, as we have discussed. But what about the other layers of the star? The other layers of the star go boom in supernova. And how does that happen? That happens because when the core is contracting, remember, fission is happening. Now, iron fission is endothermic, but as we go down and down and down, the fissions will release energy. And this energy release, now remember, this is an accelerating process happening in a very small time, and it is accelerating. So you can imagine the energy which is getting pent up in the core is increasing a lot. And now it has to push out all this energy. So this energy is transferred to the envelope of the star. Now, when this huge energy is transferred to the envelope of the envelope of the star is lower elements. It's hydrogen, helium. It is not the element which has been fused in the core. So this uh, envelope, now since it is getting so much of energy from the core, it will start nucleosynthesizing. It will start synthesizing higher elements, still iron. And at a point, at certain point, the energy transfer is so huge from the core to the envelope that explosive nuclear reactions can happen in the envelope. And then this envelope becomes very unstable, and it explodes in a phenomena called supernova. Before the supernova, the energy transfer from the core can only synthesize elements still iron in the envelope. But during the supernova, the energy is so huge that some process called the R process, nucleosynthesis, happens, and we can also get elements higher than iron. Remember, before this, I always stopped at iron, but during supernova, elements higher than iron can also be found. Now, the supernova is an astrophysical object, so naturally it has a luminosity also, and the luminosity of a supernova can be the order of the luminosity of a whole galaxy. It is so huge, and since it emits light, I can track its brightness, its absolute or apparent brightness over time. And when I track that, that is called the light curve of the object. And depending on the nature of the light curve, I divide my supernova into basically two types, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 has higher peak velocity, peak brightness, but decreases its brightness quickly over the time. Type 2 has lower peak brightness, but it remains constant for a long amount of time and decreases its brightness rather slowly when compared to type 1. Now, let's okay, before going forward, I will also like to make one distinction. Type 1 is further subdivided into type 1a and type 1b. Type 1a is a very characteristic supernova curve. Whenever we have a supernova of type 1a happening in the night sky, the light curve is exactly similar to all the other type 1a supernova. And why does that happen? Type 1a supernova happens when white dwarfs go supernova. Now you'll say, Bhaiya, you're contradicting yourself. You said that white dwarfs are quite stable. Why are they going supernova? That happens because white dwarfs, as I had said in the evolution video, white dwarfs accrete matter. Either they'll accrete it through their binary or through some neighboring ISM material, but they accrete matter over time. And if this accretion leads to the mass increase, going beyond Chandrasekhar limit, when as soon as the white dwarf crosses the Chandrasekhar limit, let's say it becomes 1.41, as soon as it will cross this Chandrasekhar limit, the electron degeneracy pressure cannot hold the star anymore, the gravitational collapse anymore, then the core will collapse and the envelope will be thrown out. And that is a type 1a supernova. And that is, since it will happen every time at 1.4 solar mass, just a little bit more than 1.4 solar mass, the light curve of a type 1a supernova is almost always similar. Then we also have type 1b supernova, which is due to the carbon burning in the degenerate core of a star. When the core has, when the core is burning carbon, let's say, because we have higher element nucleosynthesis in the core too. Carbon burning is generally very rapid, and so rapid that, like we had the helium flash, we can also have a carbon flash, and that gives rise to type 1b. Type 2 is generally supernova, which we discuss for neutron stars, black hole. It is for higher mass stars, more than 10 mass stars. When they throw up their material like this, which I was discussing over here, when these massive stars throw up their material in a supernova, that is called supernova 2. That is the supernova type 2. Now I come to the last slide of my talk. Remember, till now I was discussing for the massive stars, I discussed everything for the low mass star, but for the massive star, I was discussing about the envelope. What happens to the core? That core, it had been broken down into protons and neutrons, if you remember. If the mass of that core is 2 solar mass or 3 solar mass, the neutrons will follow the Pauli's exclusion principle and can hold the gravitational collapse due to neutron degeneracy pressure. So a star of initial mass 12 solar mass, when it goes supernova, the remaining core is 2 to 3 solar mass. Okay, that will be held by the neutron degeneracy pressure. That star is called a neutron star. Very compact star, a star of a size of a city, let's say Kolkata. It will have that much size, but it will encapsulate mass twice or thrice of that of sun in that small area. You can imagine the amount of compactness it has. And if the mass of the core is greater than this, then there's no way to halt the gravitational collapse, and we just have a black hole formation. Okay, so this was the end. This is the death of the higher mass stars, and by this I come to the end of the stellar evolution part. So now we can have our quiz. I'll have to start the quiz.
Do you want to start a quiz, or there are some questions you want to take them up?
I would want to start the quiz because I need to rest my voice.
Okay, okay.
So I'll just start the quiz, and after the quiz we can take questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so what you guys have to do, you have to go to this site, joinmyquiz.com, and I'll give you a code. You just need to enter that code. First, let me start.
Maybe you can post the link in the chat.
Yeah, can you do that? I don't see the chat right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just start the quiz.
I posted the
Great.
What is the code again?
Yes, I am giving the code. So when you go to that link, you'll be asked a code. You enter the code. I'm typing it in the chat, 221780. That is the code. You just enter that code and you'll be a participant in the quiz. I don't, like I had said, I don't like this one-to-all monotonous lecture. That's why I try to have some interactive component. It's not a quiz, it's just a trivia contest. We learn concepts using this trivia contest. Great, 10 participants are already here.
So can you maybe show it to the screen so that I can watch it?
Oh yeah, sure. No, but I think I'll be able to view the answers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just let me see one question. If I can view the answers, then I will be sharing my screen. If I can't, I'll share my screen.
Yep, sure.
Okay, 14 participants. Let me see how many people are there. 19 people, 3 of us, 2 of us. So left 17. Okay, I'll wait till 15:16 happens.
So
I'll
maybe
just wait.
I'll pause the recording for now and start when the Q&A starts.
Yes, sure, sure. Hello, hello, hello. Can
Yeah,
you
yeah,
hear
we
me?
can hear.
Okay, great. So, how many participants are here? 15 participants are here. Anybody who is yet to join can just type it in the chat, and then I'll know that this thing is not there. Uh, okay, I am starting the quiz now. Everybody be ready. The first question on your screens now. Okay, Doppler effect shifts the wavelength of the stars moving away from us. There are two options: towards the redder domain, towards the bluer domain. Just select the answer. Okay, so yeah, there is a time limit, and I am happy that all 15 of you could answer. And Surendra, I can share my screen because yes, you can't see the answer, so that's great. I'll start sharing. Okay, so the answer is towards the redder domain.
Maybe it tries to try to decrease the size. It's
Yes,
a bit more.
right. I think that would do.
Yeah, this is good. Yeah.
So yes, it increases towards the redder domain. The Doppler shift when the star is moving towards that, wavelengths are stretched, so it goes towards the redder domain. Okay, let's go to the next question. Okay, extremely hot stars do not produce absorption spectra. Is this true or false? 5 seconds left. Okay, all done. Great. So this is a very uh, smart class of students. So at the leaderboard, we have Saksham, and followed by Triple X, followed by Monkey D Baba something. Sorry if I misread that. Okay, so the correct answer is true. It's not false. Extremely hot stars do not produce absorption spectra because they ionize. The temperature is so high that the atoms get ionized. And since they are ions, the electrons are not there in the shells, so the electrons can't absorb or emit anything. So the absorption spectra is not present. Okay, let's go to the next question. Stars with low luminosity generally have a lower effective temperature. Is this true or false? Okay, all done. Great. You guys don't need a timer, I guess. So let's see the leaderboard. Triple X is at the top, followed by Monkey D Baka. Okay, so the correct answer is false. The stars with low luminosity do not generally have a lower effective temperature. The prime example is white dwarfs. They have a very high effective temperature but very low luminosity. Okay, next question. On your screens now. Which stars are called zero H stars? There are four options: red giants, blue giants, white dwarfs, main sequence stars. Select the correct option. I hope everyone gets this right. Three people left. Three, two, one. Okay, so the answer is main sequence stars. The leaderboard is Monkey Dibaka at first, followed by Venu, followed by Saksham. The correct answer is main sequence stars. I am happy 9 people answered it correctly. As I discussed during my talk, when a star enters the uh, main sequence, it is called that it is said that it is just born. And I also referred to the main sequence as the zero age main sequence once or twice deliberately for this question. Okay, next question. The luminosity of two stars at the same temperature is proportional to, this is a multiple answer correct. Remember, you can select more than one answer. Chemical composition, radius, radius squared, distance from Earth. 15 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. 3 people couldn't answer. So there's no negative marking. Just go for it if you don't even know the answer. Okay, so the leaderboard remains almost the same. You can see the correct answer are radius and radius squares. This I've discussed extensively during my talk. I just kept the radius squared is the most appropriate answer, but radius is also an answer. That's why I kept both these there. Distance from Earth, no. Why would the luminosity of a star depend on the distance from the Earth? Remember, luminosity is the energy radiated from the star. It doesn't depend whether it is near me or near you. It doesn't depend on that. It just depends on the radius of the star, the temperature of the star. So this, I'm happy people didn't choose chemical composition, which would have been even a better answer than distance from Earth, though. Distance from Earth is like the least appropriate answer over here. Okay, let's go to the next question. As we move left to right along the HR diagram, effective temperature decreases. Is this a true or a false statement? 5, 4. Okay, all done. Great. So this is a true statement, and I hope everyone is correct. Okay, Venu is at the top now, followed by Triple X. Oh, 4 people did wrong. Remember, this is a very peculiar feature of the HR diagram. The effective temperature decreases from left to right rather than increasing. Okay. Next question. How many spectral subclasses are there in total? The answers are 58, 92, 70, 60. Remember, the faster you answer, you get a little more points than the one who answers slowly. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. One person couldn't answer. That's all right. So the answer is 77 spectral classes, each class divided into 10 subspectral classes, so 70 subspectral classes. Okay, so 8 people answered 70. That's good. Let's go to the next question, which is the 8th question of the quiz. Subsolar zero age main sequence stars die younger. Is this a true or a false statement? By dying, I mean going to the planetary nebula or the giant phase. Subsolar means below solar mass. So 0.3, 0.5 solar mass. So time's up. This is a false statement. So leader is Vinu, followed by Shantanu, followed by Atharv. I am very happy people selected false. The main reason is why subsolar zero age main sequence stars do not die younger is because their mass is less. Remember, luminosity is proportional to the mass for a main sequence star. So their luminosity is less. Since their luminosity is less, they are radiating less in time. And also remember the time spent in the main sequence is proportional to mass to the power minus 2.5. So if the mass is less, the time spent is more. So that's why they die. They do not die younger. They die older than solar or other zero age main sequence stars. Okay, let's go to the next question. Older stars in a galaxy, this is a multiple answer correct, are called population 2 stars, are called population 1 stars, contain much more heavier elements outside the core than younger stars, contain much less heavier elements outside the core than younger stars. Multiple answer correct. I've given quite a lot of time in this, so think and answer. 15 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. 3 people couldn't answer, but that's all right. I'm seeing multiple answer correct. People are not willing to answer. Okay, Monkey D. Baka shot up to number 1. Okay, so this is the point of a lot of confusion. No, they are not called population 1 stars, they are called population 2 stars. And why is that? Because they have very low metallicity. Older stars in a galaxy, generally their core will be synthesizing the higher elements. But when they start off and they're the most part of the star, the envelope and the middle layers, they won't have higher elements. They'll have very low weight elements, hydrogen, helium, maybe carbon, but that's it. And these lightweight elements, this makes the star a low metallicity star, and that is why low metallicity stars come in population 2 category. So these stars are population 2 stars. One. And second is what I've explained, essentially contain much less heavier elements than outside the core than the other stars. Yes.
Aman, to be frank, even I was going to give 2 and 3. I think you should have tried to use a better word rather than older.
Okay.
So, like, I think people got confused between stars being very old or there being
Old in the galaxy, they being the just
exact.
first stars of the galaxy. I guess, okay, the framing was wrong. I should have used first stars in the galaxy.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Okay, so now this was the 9th question, midpoint of the quiz. If you have any questions regarding the quiz, the questions in the quiz, you can just ask now. I'll monitor the chat, then or we'll progress with the quiz.
And if you
Okay.
want to speak up, you can just click on yes and I'll unmute you.
I can't see the chat. While I'm sharing my screen, I can't see the chat. Okay, now it's there. Cool. So yeah, no questions till now. I'll not wait a lot of time, just a little bit of time. Cool, now I'm progressing with the quiz. Next question. CN cycle following stars are generally found in which part of the HR diagram? In the upper part of the main sequence, in the lower part of the main sequence, near the giants, below this and below the supergiants, or near the white dwarfs? Remember the hint in this question? Okay, people have started answering, so I won't give the hint. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Okay, so the answer is in the upper part of the main sequence. Remember, the upper part of the main sequence lies in the higher temperature regime, and I had said for the CNO cycle we require higher temperatures. So that's why the upper part of the main sequence, and they can't be in the giant supergiants or white dwarfs, because as Surendra said, nuclear fusion is not happening in the white dwarfs, or in giants somewhat, but mostly nuclear fusion happens in the main sequence. So you need to know that it has to be either A or B, and between them it will be A because I require more temperature. Okay, next question. The stars enriched by material released in the ISM by supernova are called first generation star, brown dwarfs, pulsars, second generation stars. Uh, this is something I discussed in the talk, so those who were awake should answer this correctly. 10 seconds left. 3, 2, 1. Time's up. So the answer is second generation stars. And this is, I had discussed this in the talk. So at the leader, we again have Monkey D. Baka. I love this name. So, okay, second generation stars, 8 of you answer correctly. That's good. 2 of you didn't answer. That's bad. Just go for any option if you're still in the quiz. Okay, next question. Which supernova light curve is this? Refer to this diagram and then select the options type 1b, type 1a, type 2, or a helium flash. Which light curve is this? Three, two, one. Time's up. Okay, so let's see the leaderboard. Okay, no shift. Did nobody answer this question correctly? Oh, 3 people answered this question correctly. So first, very big hint about this question is, remember, if I'm giving one light curve and asking you which supernova is this, I would most probably ask about a type 1a, because type 1a supernova will be the same for all phenomena. If it is a type 1a supernova, the curve will be the same. If I give you any other curve, it would not be distinct to that phenomena. And second, yes, this is a type 1a supernova. Why 1? Because if you see, after the peak, it has decreased rapidly to its pre-supernova levels. So it has decreased rapidly, and then it is remaining at its pre-supernova level. So that's why it's a type 1 supernova. And yes, this is the characteristic curve of a white dwarf type 1a supernova.
Yeah, so just to add a little thing over there.
Okay.
So till recently, I guess, I mean, recently in the sense till past 5-6 years, people actually thought that this is the characteristic curve of fire type 1A. And as people may already know, it's used as standard candles. But unfortunately, it may no longer be a standard candle because people are beginning to see some uncharacteristic feature in the light curve. But at least as far as it's concerned, at least for now, 90% of the times it's going to be a characteristic curves, but sometimes it's going to be completely different. So this usually happens, as Aman pointed out, in a binary white dwarf merger, or when there is some lot of accretion that's happening in a binary onto the white dwarf. So turns out there might be some things happening in that binary which can actually lead to a different characteristic, a different curve. I can put up the link later. If people are interested, they can read the article.
Yes, thank you, Surendra, for that really interesting information. So yeah, like I also read that. I didn't read specifically about what you said, but yes, I read that almost always this is the curve. So yes, there should be some exceptions, and I'm glad to know what are these exceptions. Okay, now next question. What is the name of the nebula left behind by a supernova recorded by Chinese astronomers in 1054 AD? The photo of the supernova is also given. Horsehead Nebula, Bernard's Loop, Crab Nebula, Orion's Nebula. Which is the correct answer? 12 people have already answered. Way to go. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And time's up. I think one person has gone inactive. Okay, leaderboard. Okay, Monkey D. Baka is still leading. And oh, I'm so happy. 14 of you got, all of you got it correct. So there's no need for any explanation, I guess. Next question. Neutron degeneracy pressure fails after 3 solar mass core. Generally, true or false? This is an approximate estimation. 3, 2, 1, go. Time's up. Sorry. Okay, 13 people answered. Leaderboard, Monkey D. Baka still leading. Third place, we have Shantanu now. And 12 of you answered it correctly. Yes, one answered wrongly. I think you were sleeping that time. But yes, after 3 solar mass, neutron degeneracy pressure cannot hold the star anymore. Next question. This is the last question of the quiz. Complete this sequence of stellar evolution. Solar mass star goes to giant star, goes to what? Goes to white dwarf. Does it go to neutron star? Does it go to black hole? Does it go to a carbon flash stage? Does it go to a planetary nebula? Okay, time's running out. 10 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up. Okay, so we have Monkey D. Baka leading. Okay, I'm happy that 8 of you selected planetary nebula, but neutron star, no way. Black hole, no way. This I had discussed in this talk, that a solar mass star will have most generally from giant to planetary nebula to a white dwarf. A carbon flash generally happens when we have carbon burning, but in giants we don't generally have carbon fusion, so planetary nebula is the correct answer. Okay, so now I'm ending the quiz and let's see the leaderboard. All of you could return to your Zoom screen to see the leaderboard.
I think it's a tie between Monkey D. Baka and Triple X.
Is it? Let's see. At third place we have Shantanu, second we have Monkey D. Baka, and first place we have Triple X. Okay, Triple X took the crown in the last question. Who are you, Triple X? Can you identify yourself in the chat?
I think he wants to remain anonymous.
Anonymous. Okay, no problem. But congratulations, Triple X and Monkey D. Baka and all and others also. So now this quiz will be present as a practice quiz where you'll have questions and answers, and you can again give the quiz. I'll send you a link. This will be present in the GitHub page. And yes, now my voice, I have given a lot of rest to my voice. So let me return back to my presentation and we can have the Q&A.
Vandana is Triple X. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Vandana. Even Monkey D. Baka can proclaim themselves. Like, who are you?
Yeah, that was a cool name.
I love that name. Wait, let me decrease the screen share and return back to my slide.
So I guess I'll start with the question.
Yes, sure.
So Sayom Bandopajay is asking, we know that light coming from stars is actually produced years before we see it, delayed due to Brownian motion. So how can we say the present state of the stars?
So first of all, delayed due to Brownian motion, I have a problem with that part of your question. No, they are not delayed due to Brownian motion. They are delayed because they are very far away from us. And second part is...
I think he's trying to refer it to sun. So the light takes a lot of time to start from core and to reach the surface.
Oh, the 6 million years thing.
Yeah. Like from the core to the surface.
Core to the surface.
So
okay, yeah, that is due to Brownian motion, but how can we know present state of the star? You can do a deep field survey of the sky. You can have telescope Hubble telescope, which essentially look backward in time. So you can generally intercept the light of the star much before, and yeah, you can, but generally there's no way to know the state of the star, present state of the star. Like if I look at Betelgeuse now, I don't know when it will go supernova. I cannot make that estimate. So yeah, it is uncertain.
But Aman, just to add to that, okay, maybe I really haven't read a lot of astroseismology,
Okay.
uh, but based on astroseismology, can't one actually describe the structure of the star? Maybe, I mean, I'm
In
not.
generally, like it's a very complex problem, right? So you can't for definite say that okay, today Betelgeuse will go uh,
I think that's
supernova.
a different question
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that, but in the main sequence is even, yeah, even that I'm not sure.
Yeah, so in a main sequence, you know the present state of the star, or you know the star state for almost a billion years. That okay, the star will remain in this state for this amount of time. That is what you can know.
Yeah,
But
not the exact state or what.
yeah, not exact state and not exactly the present state. Like if I'm seeing a star, I don't even know whether that star is there or not. That star might not have been there. It is presently not there. It has gone supernova already, but I am still seeing it. So I can't.
No, I think his question is more about the sun. It's not like that he
It's
wants.
more about the sun.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
sun they delays around 8 minutes. So you can obviously know the present state of the sun. 8 minute delay is nothing.
No, no, no. Okay, Aman, that's not the delay he's talking about. So if
Okay,
it's eight,
he's talking about the core, I guess. Then
yeah,
he
yeah,
would know the status of the core.
yeah, yeah.
So generally in main sequence, the core of the stars follow same pattern, and we know the state that they are burning hydrogen fusion. Yeah, they're burning hydrogen.
Yep. So, so one Shantanu Das, in connection to the previous question, is asking how why does Brownian motion happen and how does it happen in the star?
Why does Brownian motion happen? I don't have any answer to this question. I just know that as a postulate of kinetic theory of gas. Excuse me. And how does it happen? Again, like there's a description in kinetic theory that these are random motion with some or no effective displacement, and it just the motion driven from internal energy or the thermal energy. Say that it comes from the kinetic theory. It's a postulate of the kinetic theory actually.
Physically, I think it can be imagined as the photon being scattered from one atom to the other atom. The atom may
Yes,
be a neutral
yes,
one or
yes,
an ionized one.
yes. Yeah, collisions and scatterings.
Scattered.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
and that can be approximated as a Brownian motion.
Brownian motion. Yes.
And next, Vandana is asking, how long does it take a protostar to become a main sequence star? Does the duration would depend upon its mass?
Yes, yes. How long that estimate? I don't have the proper estimate. See, a cloud of gas. There's some criteria, which is called the Jeans criteria, which is again like a Chandrasekhar limit. So there's some limit. As soon as the mass has increases goes beyond that Jeans criteria, it starts collapsing. So now, depending on the initial mass of the collapse, it's not like as soon as it will cross it, there might be some huge stellar nursery. So there might be a huge cloud of gas which is collapsing in certain sections, and then again it is merging. So depending on the different mass of the clumps of the gas we have, that defines the initial mass of the main sequence star. And yes, if the mass is more, the contraction is accelerated, and we might come down to the main sequence earlier. Point in support of this is, let me show you the video again, and I think that might clear that up. Let me go to this. Sorry.
So while you're trying to
Share.
go to that, Vandana, I think you should definitely attend the star formation talks that we're going to have.
Yes.
So there they're going to talk way more detailed on how stars form, what are the different criteria, what are the open questions, etc.
Yes. So if you see this stellar cluster evolution, you see the stars which are more massive are falling much more quickly to the main sequence than the stars which have low mass. And why do I say these stars have more mass? Because these stars have higher luminosity than these stars. And remember, on or near the main sequence, luminosity and mass are directly proportional. So if luminosity is more, the mass is more. So higher mass stars fall more quickly on the main sequence than the lower mass stars. Okay.
Yeah. The next question from Atharva: why only up to iron elements can form in the core of a star, and others are formed in supernova explosion? I think you did answer this question in the talk.
Yes.
So this came before you talked about supernova and the
Yes.
carbon, nitrogen chain, etc.
Yes, yes. So
But
just to recap a little bit, the binding energy per nucleon of iron nuclei is the highest. So if you need to break the iron nuclei, you need to give more energy than the energy emitted. So it's a very stable nuclei, and core contraction cannot provide for the energy of fusion of higher elements. Supernova has a lot of energy. So supernova and the time is also very important. So the abruptness and the energy released in the supernova, that leads to something called R process nucleosynthesis, where the rapid capture of neutrons happens. So that leads to the formation of higher elements. Yes.
and next, Venu Dhingra is asking, can we quantify degeneracy pressure?
Yes, yes, why not? But I don't have a quantification of that. In terms of energy, it is equal, electron degeneracy pressure is equal to the gravitational collapse pressure of a 1.4 solar mass star. Equal, yeah, uh, can hold. But yeah, we can quantify it. Why not? It's a pressure. But sorry, I don't have the quantification. If Surendra, if you know of some quantity, you
Yeah,
can share.
so the thing is, the way we estimate it is using quantum statistical mechanics, wherein we actually take a phase space of momentum and position, and there, if you actually see, one can estimate the pressure from there. But the exact expression, as far as I remember, it's proportional to the yeah. I don't. Maybe I'll try put it on the GitHub page. So
Great.
Venu, do look up at the GitHub page. So I'll try putting it in the same talk README file. So next, Atharva is asking, is quantum tunneling possible in star or is it important? If it is, can you just brief this concept?
Uh, so I don't know of any processes, major processes which are aided by quantum tunneling. Maybe Surendra can add later. And a brief about quantum tunneling is, if you have a quantum state or a quantum particle in a potential barrier. What do I mean a potential barrier? Like if a gravitational potential barrier may be a huge steep mountain and you are in the valley, that is a gravitational potential barrier for you. Similarly, we have Coulomb potential barriers, and if a quantum particle is confined in a Coulomb potential or some generalized potential region, then the particle has some bound states inside the potential and some free states outside the potential. But even while it's bound, sometimes it can cross the barrier, and from bound it can go to the unbound states, and that happens due to a phenomenon called quantum tunneling. I do not know the exact the quantum mechanical description or something like that of quantum tunneling, but yeah, that is the gist.
Yeah, unfortunately, even I don't. I mean, people keep asking this question. I think we should look into this. I mean,
Yes.
earlier talk, people asked quantum tunneling, but I never really came across application of quantum tunneling in a regular star. I just remembered, Venu Dhingra, you said how can we quantify degenerate pressure? Yeah, we can. So it's actually square of Fermi momentum and Fermi energy.
Ah,
So
yes, yes. Fermi energy. Yes, you use Fermi energy to quantify the pressure.
yeah. So the Fermi energy is nothing but square root over your energy of the particle times the Fermi momentum of the particle that's under consideration. It can be either a electron or any other fermion, but as to how exactly you estimate the momentum and the energy, rest energy, I can put that expression later on the GitHub page. So the next is, yeah, how otherwise asking how stellar evolution is different for star having planetary system versus star without any planetary system.
So planets will have very less impact on stellar evolution as such, because if you even see in our solar system, the biggest planet, Jupiter, is very small in comparison, very small and far away in comparison to the sun. What they can do is change the dynamics of the star, the astrodynamics, but not they can't either aid or stop the fusion processes or its general tracks. So yeah, planets can't do that.
Yeah. And I just put the link referring to the article wherein I was trying to convey a message that the characteristic curves of a type 1a supernova and the intrinsic luminosity may not actually be a constant all the time, may not be the same. So in regards to that, there's an article recently written, it's called Double Trouble, and I put it in the chat so you can read the article later. And if you have any questions, you can always message me
Is,
or
is, is this a Astrobytes article?
not. I don't think so. It's in a Science magazine article.
Ah, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think maybe I don't remember if people have written.
Yeah, I remember reading something like this in Astrobytes also.
Yeah, otherwise saying that he did read an Astrobyte article related to that. Yeah. So if people have any more questions, they can put it up in the chat, or you can click on yes and you can speak up. I'll wait for 1 minute.
I think you can stop the recording now.
Yeah.